Hi, I'm Sarah Lennox. I'm on the Northampton Neighbors Board and a member of the Speaker Series Committee that's bringing you all these terrific talks. I'm also the moderator for today's really exciting talk. And in case you haven't attended one of these talks before, I want to let you know how it's all going to work before we get to our main attraction, Christopher Clark. But even before that, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. We're bringing you this talk from the ancestral lands of the Bokumtuk, Norwatuk, Woronoco, Agawam, Nipmuc, and Abenaki peoples who are still living here among us today. I know we've got people from all over in our audience, a lot of people, so welcome to all of you. So for those of you who don't know about us yet, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Northampton Neighbors. We're an all-volunteer organization whose slogan is a nice pun, engaging in place, which is to say, we're helping our members to age in place with dignity, self-determination, and joy by engaging in place, creating community, making connections, and remaining active via volunteer opportunities, interest groups, and cultural events like this one. Northampton Neighbors provides support and a whole range of services for people 55 and over living in Northampton, Florence, and Leeds, though anyone living anywhere can join. We're part of the nationwide village movement, which this year is celebrating its 20th anniversary, and there are 19 villages in Massachusetts alone. We were the first one in Western Massachusetts. But the way we're different from most villages is that our membership is free, so that there are not any barriers to anyone becoming part of our community. As of today, we have 1,172 members, which is pretty amazing. So if you aren't a member yet, we'd love it if you'd become part of us. And so please go to our website and sign up. As you saw in the opening slide, this talk is also co-presented by Historic Northampton and the David Ruggles Center, and we thank them very much for collaborating with us. Since I'm also on the boards of both of those organizations, I'd like to tell you a little about them as well. Historic Northampton is our historical society consisting of 4 historical buildings located on a beautiful campus right across from the post office, and its mission is to collect and preserve Northampton's past and to explore the town's history and the interconnections between human history and the natural world. Historic Northampton is a community partner in Northampton Neighbors. The David Ruggles Center is a small museum located at 225 Nonotuck Street in Florence that commemorates the radical utopian community that Chris is going to talk about, and more broadly, the local Black and white abolitionists who helped formerly enslaved people make their way to safety. Northampton Neighbors, Historic Northampton, and the Ruggles Center are institutions that help to make Northampton the wonderful place it is, and we hope you will continue to support all of them. And now to our guest. Christopher Clark is a lot more eminent than the modest bio he gave us to include on our PR. He grew up in the London area. He studied at the University of Warwick, and he obtained his PhD in history at Harvard. He taught at the University of York in the UK for 18 years, was professor of North American history at the University of Warwick for another 7 years before moving to the University of Connecticut in 2005. He's had many awards and honors, which I won't tell you about, but if you want to know more about him, you can go look him up. You can Google him, which is the way we find out anything anymore. In the bio that Chris provided for our PR, he did tell us about his 3 books that deal with the Northampton area: The Roots of Rural Capitalism, Western Massachusetts, 1780 to 1860, The Communitarian Moment, The Radical Challenge of the Northampton Association, and Letters from an American Utopia, edited with Carrie Buckley. Now, it happens that I have read all 3 of those books, and I can recommend them strongly to you. In fact, I love those books. They're not only, of course, works of great erudition and creative interpretation, but they're also filled with great passion and love for his subject matter, which I think will also be evident in his talk today. I believe Chris is retiring from UConn at the end of the semester, so I hope we see him around Northampton and around Northampton neighbors a lot more from now on. So now, Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening if you're in Spain. Thank you all very much for coming, and thanks from me to Northampton neighbors, Historic Northampton and the Ruggles Centre for sponsoring this event, which I very much enjoyed preparing for. So in April 1842, which is just over 180 years ago, a group of radical abolitionists formed what they called the Northampton Association of Education and Industry, a utopian community which they sustained for 4.5 years until November 1846, at a place that was then called Broughton's Meadow in the northern part of Northampton, Mass. And this is a map of the immediate area that they occupied. They had about 470 acres of land, much of the area covered by this version provided kindly by Steve Strymer of an 1879 bird's eye view map of Florence. And you can see just by comparing those two maps how much had changed between the early 1840s and the late 1870s in that area, the part of Northampton that became the village of Florence in 1852. And the Northampton Association, which I'm going to talk about, had a good deal to do with that transformation. The community itself had about a total of something just over 240 members, usually no more than about 120 at any one time over the 4.5 years that it existed. It ran a silk factory, which it had purchased at a discount from the people who'd built it and then gone bankrupt. It ran a farm, it ran workshops and a lumber yard, and it also ran a school for a period. Of the people whose occupations we know, more than a third were merchants or managers or professional people, but almost 2/3 of the membership were ordinary folk. They were farmers, artisans, clerks, laborers, or factory operatives. And whoever they were, their wealth was modest. They were not wealthy people. Well, as Sarah has already said, I've written 2 books about this, so there's a great deal of detail, and this is a short talk. So I'm just going to frame what I'm going to say around the theme that I've announced and talk about it in a couple of ways. And I'd be happy to answer questions in any detail afterwards if people want to know more. And I took this phrase used by a communitarian activist in the 1840s, referring to live in the common cause. And I want to explore that here in 2 senses. The cause, first of all, of reform, and particularly of abolitionism. And secondly, the common experience of living in community itself. So the cause of reform, wait a minute, sorry about that. Abolitionism, the campaign against slavery in the United States, took an important step in the late 1820s with the publication of a pamphlet by David Walker called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, which made the argument that slavery should be abolished immediately and without compensation for slave owners. And this was picked up rapidly by Black abolitionists and by William Lloyd Garrison in Boston, who in 1831 launched his newspaper, The Liberator, which became the single most prominent organ advocating for immediate abolition. And over the course of the 1830s, the abolitionist movement multiplied, particularly, of course, in the North and particularly in New England. But it also underwent various changes, including disagreements among its participants as to strategy and purpose. And so the Garrisonian wing of abolitionism emerges at the end of the 1830s as the remnant of what really had become a sort of schismatic movement. Garrisonians were strong advocates of what they call moral suasion. That is, that they eschewed the use of politics to achieve change. They argued for moral reform as the basis of social reform. One of the reasons for that was that they advocated equality between men and women, and they pointed out that women were excluded from politics in this period. Of course, until 1919, in most places, women couldn't vote. And so, thirdly, many, though not all of them, were advocates of what was called non-resistance, that is, adherence to the passage in St. Matthew's Gospel, in which Christ says, "I say unto you that you resist not evil, but whoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." And this was a principle that, first of all, rejected the use of force in any form. It was a form of pacifism, but it also rejected the authority of government to control. In other words, it referred to the government of God and to the morals of people rather than to artificial institutions. So abolitionism by the end of the 1830s was not a single issue. It was linked to more radical social and moral reforms, including arguments for gender and racial equality. And partly because of the schisms that had taken place, abolitionists and other reformers looked to what we would now call intentional communities, self-formed utopian communities, if you like, as vehicles for carrying forward this reform in the early 1840s. And this is just a graph of the numbers of these communities founded each decade in the 19th century in the United States that we know about. And you can see the 1840s stand out as the decade, and in fact, it's the first half of the decade in which most of these communities existed. Reformers linked to abolitionism advocated what they called cooperative associations. One Bostonian abolitionist regarded them as a most encouraging sign of an urgent purpose to remedy the cause of the evils which prevail in this disjointed world. And one of their principal, as it were, media backers, the New York editor Horace Greeley, announced in his New York Tribune in 1842, "These attempts after a perfect society are plainly the most important things now doing. All other philanthropic effort is fragmentary and superficial." But what did setting up a community like this in Western Massachusetts have to do with combating slavery in the American South? Well, there were several aspects to that. The community served abolitionists in a number of ways. First of all, it provided a shelter. Many of the people who came to Northampton to join the community had come from Connecticut, where the abolitionist movement was in particular, I won't say disarray, the splits in the movement were particularly severe in Connecticut. And Connecticut was also a center of very considerable anti-abolitionist activity. So abolitionists like Garrisonians in Connecticut felt themselves particularly embattled. And Garrison had himself called Connecticut the Georgia of New England. And one of his supporters in Connecticut, who would join the Northampton Association, referred to Fairfield County as the Georgia of Connecticut. An example of families that were in this position were a man and his family called George Benson from Brooklyn, Connecticut, who became one of the principal founders of the Northampton community in 1842, having helped to purchase this bankrupt silk company property. But the other point about this is that through people like Benson, there were important kinship connections among members of the community. And this is just a diagram of one of that set of connections between Benson and his sister, who married William Lloyd Garrison, but also his sister-in-law, who was also his wife, who was the sister of two other members of the Northampton community, whom we know a lot about now because we got their letters a number of years ago, and those are now at historic Northampton. So the community formed a shelter. It also formed a base for abolitionist activities, campaigning and lecturing locally and afield, assisting fugitive slaves. So one of the members, Sophia Ford, writes in what's now become a famous letter in May 1843 that she had seen one fugitive who had come through and had gone on, and there was another one expected on what she called the railroad underground, one of the first uses of this phrase that we know of. And following from this, the community also would serve as a basis for an abolitionist mission. And Erasmus Hudson, one of the members of the community, writes to another abolitionist in 1843, trying to encourage her to come here. I think we will make this a moral reform depot for anti-slavery, non-resistance, holiness, etc., and then go forth east, west, north, and south to work, making this headquarters. So the Northampton Association would form a model of a reformed society. Moral reform would lead to social reform, as I suggested. At one of the community's weekly meetings, a visiting abolitionist contended that we are all slaves and that we must emancipate ourselves before we can do anything efficiently for them of the South. That was a contentious point, but it summed up a moral suasionist position. One of the fugitive slaves who lived in the society for a period, a man called Stephen Rush, wrote in 1844 in a letter to Garrison, which was published in The Liberator, "We are here to honor liberty and to denounce slavery, to testify against oppression, deepen the detestation of tyranny, and proclaim the dictates of eternal justice. For these purposes," he wrote, "we must turn to the common peoples who will come to the help of the Lord against the mighty." So the Northampton Association was, in a sense, the common peoples. Dolly Witter Stetson, whom I mentioned briefly, writes to her husband in 1845 when he's thinking of leaving the community and they're debating whether to do so. She argues to him, can we do as much good to return to our isolated condition, where whatever of moral power we may possess will be rendered powerless because we have not the wealth and station to render us worthy of notice? She is making an argument there for collective action. And the community, in its own announcement, embraces what it calls the Christian principle of the equal brotherhood of the race, racial, gender, and class equality, one of the community's favorite biblical texts was from Paul's letter to the Galatians. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one. And the community was one of the few places anywhere in the United States in the 1840s where white and black could live together on a basis of equality. So that was the collective cause, the reform cause. But there's also, of course, the common cause, the process of living in community, and that was also important. So at the same time as the Northampton community is going on, or late in its history, Henry David Thoreau has repaired to his house on the shore of Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, to write, including the first draft of what would become his famous book, Walden, published in 1854. And when he published Walden, he explained, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. The Northampton Association was a collective effort to live deliberately, with deliberation, to work out a model of society that would be freed from slavery, competition, and contention. The association's constitution announced that it was a combination of families and individuals that would work to counteract ignorance, bigotry, and to dignify labor, obtain efficiency through machinery, ensure education for all, and ensure that the rights of all are equal, without distinction of sex, color, or condition, sect, or religion. In the first year of its existence, the community was organized somewhat along the lines of a traditional capitalist venture. There was a stock company which controlled part of its activities, to which belonged the people who had invested in the community. And then there was another body called the industrial community, which was everybody else. And each met separately, and each was democratic in its own way, but they sort of counterbalanced each other. But in the spring of the late winter of 1843, the community voted to change that arrangement and to publish a more radical constitution in which the distinction was abolished. And instead of paying wages to workers, it would support everybody on an equal basis. It became a non-wage, democratic, cooperative institution, which lasted in that form for the remainder of its existence. It's about 3.5 years, that is. James Stetson from Brooklyn, Connecticut, saw this new constitution at the beginning of 1843 and wrote to Dolly, his wife, that he thought they should join. I think you will find spirits, congenial spirits here with whom you can be happy and in whose activities you can happily partake. Frederick Douglass, who visited the community on 2 occasions in 1844 and again in 1845, much later wrote in a memoir of it that it was the most democratic I had ever met. The community functioned around the work that it had, silk manufacturing and the other activities I've mentioned, around education, and around functioning as a cooperative venture. Dolly Stetson's daughter, Almira, writes in 1845 that I want a good education, and I think I have an opportunity here of improving every moment. There is enthusiasm here. And Elmira slightly later gets into a long conversation with another member, an artist and craftsman called Elisha Hammond, who has evidently drawn up a plan for new buildings and landscaping at the community. And Elmira writes to her father in excitement that we had visions of future bliss. But it was not to be. For various reasons, the setup began to unravel from 1844 to 46 until it was finally wound up. And that came about in several respects. First of all, the main business of the community, which was to manufacture sewing silk, was costly, and there were production and supply difficulties which added to the costs of working, which meant that it was hard for the community to pay off the debts that it had accumulated in setting itself up. And over time, that economic pressure increased. And despite the hard work of the people in the community, it was insufficient to clear it. Advantages of belonging to the community dwindled as this financial pressure mounted. Added to this, because this was a moral reform community in which the principle of moral suasion meant that there were no religious creeds or formal rules that people were expected to follow. There were informal ones. People were expected to find their own way. There was very considerable debate and democratic debate, but there were also contentions, things that people disagreed over. And in particular, there was disagreement over the community's authority over children. Parents and the community sometimes were in contention over who had the right to say what would happen in education or whatever. It sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? But there's also contention over questions about more general behavior, particularly over the category of what people referred to as amusements. Some people got upset because boys would play stickball on the property on a Sunday. Other people got upset because people were making Sunday out to be a special day. There were members of the community who were fond of dancing. They included Dolly Whitter Stetson, who writes about it. But there were others, including Sojourner Truth, for example, who had joined the community in 1843. And one of the community leaders, Samuel L. Hill, who strongly disapproved of it. And this caused ructions. And by 1845, quite a number of members were leaving. And included in the people who were leaving were people who had been teachers in the community's school. Several of them went elsewhere. And by 1845 also, the demographic balance of the community was shifting. It had always been a relatively young community. Of all the 240 people who were involved, only about 6 were aged 50 or more when they joined it. But after the middle of 1845, over half the membership was under 18 years of age. But with schooling dwindled because people had left, and with the hard work that was required, this increasingly became a system not of education, but of child labor. And during 1845 and 46, preparations are being made to wind the community up. Part of it is sold off to George Benson in 1845. And in November 1846, the community finally winds up. Now, I've mentioned internal causes for that change, but there are also important changes in the outside world as well. First of all, in an economy and society generally. This has been the period of the 1837 depression and its subsequent depression. By the mid-1840s, the economy is picking up again, and there's more going on outside. But secondly, abolitionism itself has changed during this period. The initial emphasis among Garrisonians on problems in the North, and particularly the problems that churches would not support abolitionism, gets replaced by the mid-1840s with a renewed emphasis on the South itself. The publication of slave narratives, not least Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, the most famous of all, published in 1845. The crisis over the admission of Texas and then the Mexican War in 1846, those coupled with the abolitionist society's shift towards a policy of disunion, no union with slaveholders was the Garrisonian slogan after 1844, meant that what I have called the communitarian moment, which had brought these things together at the NAAI in radical reform, is passing. And so the passing of the community is in some ways in tune not only with internal, but with external factors. But the formal disbanding of the community did not mean abandonment of its ideals or of its pursuit of community or of the pursuit of these things in the area that became Florence in the next decade. So to go back to Thoreau again for a minute, at the end of Walden, he wrote, "I left the woods for as good a reason as I went there. Perhaps it seemed to me that I had several more lives to live and could not spare any more time for that one." And so it was at the Northampton community. Members, including Samuel L. Hill and others, had since 1844 been talking about forming what they called a neighborhood community. And in the event, at least 67 former members of the Northampton community stayed on, at least for a time, in the area that became Florence. And some of them would stay for the rest of their lives and are still there today. Here are just 3 grave markers in the Park Street Cemetery in Florence. All the names on these particular markers are of people who, either as adults or as children, were members of the Northampton community. It's just a sign of its continued existence, in a sense. And while they remained in this neighborhood community, they continued to pursue a variety of reform efforts: political abolitionism, continuing with the Underground Railroad, temperance reform, hydropathy, water cure therapy, and a view of business which, in a sense, separated business interests from community interests. So if we look back at this map, which is the right way up this time, all of these rings represent buildings that refer to the association. The blue ones are during the period of the association. The red ones are residences of people from the association who moved to live in what became streets of Florence in the years after it dissolved. So the community had 3 key effects on what became Florence. It affected the townscape in these neighborhoods. This is an example. This was Elisha Hammond's house on, or still exists, on 26 Maple Street, typical of the kind of house that was built in the immediate aftermath of the community. It also strongly affected the development of industry and business in the village. Samuel Hill and the what became the Nonotuck Silk Company, the business also founded by a Northampton community member that eventually became the Florence Sewing Machine Company, and the early development of a form of plastics in the manufacture of daguerreotype cases. And then several other businesses, including what's now the Florence Bank and the Florence Casket Company, which I notice is still existing. So it had a business effect. And finally, it had a profound effect on religion and education in the community in Florence. The association had always held informal religious meetings, non-denominational meetings during its existence. And these continued very informally in the years to follow. But in 1863, a number of the people who'd been involved in this, coupled with newcomers, formed what was called the Free Congregational Society, a non-denominational Christian congregation that met in Florence and lasted until separately until the early 1920s. It built this extraordinary building, Cosmian Hall, which existed until 1948 on what is now the Florence Civic and Business Association, the corner of Main and Park Street. The interior of this, the auditorium of this building was lined with that quotation from the book of Galatians, "There is neither Jew nor Greek." And also, although the Free Congregational Society and Cosmian Hall have passed into history, there was also the Florence Kindergarten, founded in 1876. And in 1881, endowed under the will of Samuel L. Hill, which specified the condition, and it continues today as the Hill Institute, on condition that it would foster the physical, moral, and intellectual development of children, unmixed with ecclesiastical or theological exercises or influence, and be open to all residents of Florence, without distinction of race, nationality, or previous condition. So the spirit of the Northampton Association had lived on in Florence's fabric and in its institutions, and played a significant role in the village's growth and development. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was really, really wonderful. I'm just thrilled to about everything you've told us, and I'd love to hear about the association. And we'd now love to take your questions, and please type them in the chat. And I'm going to lead off with a question, which is maybe guilty of presentism, but
aren't we all?
Yes, right. So when I taught at UMass, taught 19th century German thought, I used to say the 1840s were like the 1960s.
Yes.
Yes. So I'm wondering, are there lessons for us today?
Oh, well, which I'm sure there are.
What do you think the lessons are?
Well, it's to do with those ideals, isn't it? I think, first of all, I mean, we live now apparently in a very divided and contentious society, we're told. And yet, here is a clear, and these people lived in a divided and contentious society. In fact, of course, it was one that was 20 years later going to be fighting a civil war over precisely the issues that these people were concerned about. So at one level, this sounds not a very hopeful prospect. On the other hand, they did manage to do this for 4.5 years. They managed to turn it into something else positive, even after their first idea It didn't exactly bite the dust, but they decide. I think actually Thoreau's remark, maybe it was I had another life to live, is apposite here, because people were flexible enough to decide, well, look, is there a better way we can do this? And they did, and they helped. They were not the only ones, of course, but they helped to build a community which is still thriving today. Indeed, seems to be doing very well indeed at the present, despite all the problems.
Wonderful.
So I think there are lessons for today.
Great. So here's an interesting question in the chat. Can you talk more about if or how members saw the NAEI, how they saw community as a vehicle for social change? How did they reconcile an inward focus on self-governance and survival versus trying to influence others about the need for abolition and equality?
Right. Okay, that's a really good question. And you pointed to the, apparent contradiction. Here we go, we form a community, we are concerned about ourselves. And what has this got to do with the reform we're trying to bring about, which is abolishing slavery, actually, frankly, hundreds of miles and several states away. So that, of course, was a conundrum, which was never resolved. The method that these people hoped could bring about the end of slavery, could bring about a moral reform in society, which would lead people to reject slavery, clearly didn't work, or at least it didn't. It would have taken so much longer to work, and in fact, slavery was brought to an end in the context of a set of events which these people would have found horrifying in prospect. They were pacifists. They did not support the use of violence. And so the idea that slavery would have to be ended by war was a horrific one to them. And so one way of looking at that question is to say, well, you've got a really good point. And these people, I wouldn't want to be harsh and say they were on the wrong side of history, but they were not on the side that prevailed. On the other hand, though, they clearly believed that they could offer examples, and they were not the only people who did this. They could offer examples of how a society that was based on principles of equality, and as I mentioned, that's in terms of gender, race, and class. It wasn't perfect, of course, but they espoused these principles, could actually be made to work. And one can argue that they did, for a period, make it work. And to a great extent, Florence as a village continued to enunciate those principles, even when people were no longer living in a cooperative community, but had sort of separated into their separate families and households. So I think it's partly example. We can make this work. Secondly, there's a very strong strand in this moral reform movement, which is deeply rooted in Christian principles, but of particular types of Christian principle, that developing perfection or close to it, renouncing sin in any particular person can work to end sin in the world more generally. And they sincerely believed that. And indeed, the contrast between people like them and people like Thoreau, who resisted invitations to join the Brook Farm community, because he, like Emerson, his mentor, basically said, this doesn't suit me. They were arguing, it only takes one individual to reform the world. It sounds naive in a way, but it was a genuinely held belief. And I think that's how they reconciled that particular conundrum that the question points to.
So I have a follow-up question to that. How harmonious was the association? Was there evidence of jealousy or selfishness? Were most of the members truly not racist? Was Sojourner Truth treated like all the white women?
That's a great question, and one has to say one can't be absolutely sure, right? To come to the last question first, the late Paul Gaffney wrote about this in the volume that we published of the Stetson Letters, and you can see in his essay there his sort of well worked out argument about the extent to which racial equality did and did not work in this context. There are very few members of color. It's predominantly a white institution, and it's predominantly a family-based institution. And the two African-American members who were there longest, Ruggles and Sojourner Truth, were single people. They were not married. I hadn't dwelt on this, but there is some grounds for suggesting that, as it were, married people had some advantages in this community that single people didn't. In that respect, it's a little different from somewhere like Brook Farm, which worked slightly differently. As to harmony, there were clearly dissensions, and sometimes not violent in the physical sense, but people left sometimes because they resented the strength of language that was used in criticizing one another. I mean, every Sunday, and it wasn't because it was Sunday, it was just because they did it on that day, they were very careful to say, we don't attach particular significance to this day of the week, but because everybody else is doing this on Sunday, we'll do it as well. Sunday afternoons were taken up with these meetings in which there were discussions of reform and particularly religious matters. And they would have visitors, people came by. Sometimes they were visiting reformers, sometimes they were visiting abolitionists, sometimes they were visiting ministers from other local churches who came to dispute with them. And so they would have disputes of that kind, but there would also be obviously differences among members of the community. And sometimes that led to ructions and people would leave. There was also sort of increasing tension over the question of finances, which obviously didn't help matters. And then, as I mentioned, the situation in which, particularly from 1845 to 6, an increasing burden is being put on young members of the community to do the work that had to be done. And that caused concern as well. In fact, the Stetsons left. They didn't leave the area immediately, but they left the community before it wound up, in part because of the burden that was being put on the elder of their children who were still teenagers. So there were many sources of difficulty.
Right. Good. Okay, here's another question. I've wondered this too. What factors led to the choice of Northampton, Florence over other locations?
Because they, well, okay, there are several strands to this. First of all, several of these people, including not Benson, but Hill was one of them, and a number of others from Connecticut, were already involved in some way or another in the silk manufacturing industry, which had actually been quite well established in northeastern Connecticut, where most of them came from. the area around, the place I teach at the University of Connecticut, in fact. But the reason they bought this property was that a company called the Northampton Silk Company had invested a significant sum of money in 1836 to 7 in this four-story mill that was quite an elaborate, large building for its context at that point. And it had then gone bankrupt. It was being run by some Connecticut silk manufacturers who were sort of making money while the property was on the market. And they were able to obtain this property at a discounted price. And so in some ways, it was fortuitous that they came here. And that's the simplest explanation for why here.
Okay. On another topic, what was the curriculum like at the NE, at the school? Did they relate Bible stories even though community was non-denominational? And how many students and teachers were involved?
Okay, that's quite a complicated question, so I'm not going to be able to give a very easy answer to it because it varied from time to time. The number of students and teachers fluctuated. It was small at first. It grew in 1843 to 44. There were probably, I'm counting off the top of my head, there were probably 5 or 6 members who were offering instruction, and that may not include members of their families who were also doing it, but without necessarily having formal notice of that. So many of the students in the school were the children in the community. And one of the issues, of course, was, when would children be being in school and when would they be asked to work? And that varied from time to time. And as I said, by 1845, work had become the greater part of that. And as to the curriculum, that depended somewhat on who was doing the teaching. So just to give 2 examples, one of the teachers was a founding member of the community, a Scotsman called William Adam, who's a really fascinating character. He had gone to India as a Baptist missionary in the 1820s, had been converted to Unitarianism by a Hindu monotheist, tried to form a Unitarian congregation in Calcutta, but found it sort of taken over by the locals. Eventually left, spent a year, not a very happy year, at Harvard as a professor of Oriental languages and literature. He was a very learned man. Ended up connected with the abolitionist movement and came to Northampton in 1842, largely through that, and started to give instruction. Well, here was a guy who was fluent in Bengali and various other classical and Oriental languages, but the reports suggest that he was as dry as a stick as a teacher, and so that was probably not great. Another of the teachers was a woman called Sophia Ford, who came in 1843. She's the person who wrote about the railroad underground. She and some others seem to have used a curriculum that made a good deal of use of play and of practical demonstration, of learning by doing. In some ways, they were forerunners of Froebel and the kindergarten movement, which picked up in Florence in the 1870s. Ford herself left, I think, in 1845. She was a tutor for a while to the Alcott girls in Concord, and then went to an abolitionist family in Rhode Island as a tutor. So, I mean, some of them had, really what were then really quite advanced curricular methods.
Okay, here is a question that I think will have unfortunately, a very short answer. Were there any Jewish people involved?
Not to my knowledge.
That's what I thought. Yes. Okay, I'm going to take, I think, one more question. Yes. Okay, which is maybe a long one. Were the married members monogamous, and did child rearing happen within the nuclear family, or did they adopt any of the beliefs and practices of the Oneida group at Oneida, for instance, group marriage, collective child rearing?
Marriage was monogamous. They proclaimed that, and there is no real evidence. I mean, there were rumors, but the rumors were spread by people who were opposed to them, not really in the locality. I think it was more in the wider movement. The evidence is that marriage was monogamous and was expected to be, and it's not clear that that was violated. There is certainly nothing like Oneida's complex marriage. The philosophical bases for it were quite different from Northampton's assumptions. I mean, Oneida was based on the assumption that the Second Coming had happened in AD 70, and that we were now living in the millennium. The Northampton community members thought that if they were millennialist at all, thought that they were helping to build a society that would bring the millennium on. They were, as I said, non-resistant. They were very skeptical of the authority of formal government organizations, because government, I mean, this is almost a century before Max Weber, they regarded as an institution that is ultimately based on force and therefore deeply questionable. So there were marriages conducted at the community, and quite a number, in fact. And a point was always made that even if there were a civil officer present, like a justice of the peace, the poor justice of the peace, there was a guy called Oliver Warner who came to at least one of these occasions to solemnize a marriage, and had to listen to a long speech by George W. Benson explaining how his presence was not necessary. But then, they did it anyway. But there is an occasion which Paul Gaffney discusses in his essay about a couple who announced that they were married, that their spirits were united. And I think this was in 1844, early. And it's not clear who made the decision that this should happen, whether it was on his own volition or whether somebody asked him to do it. David Ruggles went and, as we would say in England, had a word with them and basically told them that they should leave because this was not acceptable. And they did leave. They went to another community in Michigan, which turned out to be a hellhole, and they came back again. The young woman was suffering from tuberculosis, and she in fact died at the Northampton community. She wanted to die among friends. It's a very tragic story. She was buried on the community ground. So the one example we have of someone, I mean, there's no evidence, there's no suggestion that this was other than a verbal declaration that they were married. there's no evidence of, premarital sex or anything like that. We just don't know. There clearly was a sanction. So I think the evidence is that it was monogamous, and it stressed the family.
I think that is all our questions, and we have found that it does not work very well to applaud, but let us applaud with our with our hands, and that was just completely wonderful, Christopher. Thank you so very much. And I have to say something about our coming attractions. The speaker series is taking a summer break. But there is something scheduled for the next fall. Our next speaker will be Dr. Patricia Romney, who's a 5-college psychologist, a leadership consultant, and a board member of Amherst Neighbors, and she's going to be speaking on equity and aging. We don't have a date yet. We don't know whether it'll be in person or in Zoom. Depends a lot on the state of the pandemic, but it will be sometime in September or October. And we will certainly let you know in plenty of time. So stay tuned. And thank you all for coming today. And thank you, Chris Clark, for that really wonderful talk.
Well, thank you all. It's been a great pleasure.
Bye-bye, everybody.